Back in the late 1990s, I was in my early 20s, navigating life as a young gay man in a medium-sized city in the Midwest. It was an interesting period, a kind of liminal space for people like me. We were just starting to enjoy a modicum of acceptance in larger, more progressive areas, yet significant pockets of resistance and outright hostility still very much existed. The digital age was blossoming, yet it hadn't fully bloomed. The internet was more of a novelty than a necessity, and the concept of smartphones was nothing more than science fiction. For most of us, connecting online meant dial-up modems, AOL chat rooms, and the early, clunky versions of social media platforms. But for the gay community, these digital spaces were revolutionary. They provided sanctuaries where we could express our identities and connect with others who shared our realities and dreams. I lived in an apartment just big enough to claim a separate kitchen and living room, which I filled with thrift store finds and hand-me-downs that felt like treasures. I spent my days working at a local bookstore and my nights exploring the burgeoning online world from my bulky desktop computer, which whirred and beeped like a small spaceship gearing up for liftoff. One evening, as I was browsing through a popular gay chat room, a message popped up from a user named Mike123. It was casual, commenting on a book I had casually mentioned in one of my earlier messages in the forum. We quickly struck up a conversation, finding common ground over literature and our shared experiences of growing up gay in conservative environments. Mike was intriguing, witty, knowledgeable, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and feelings. Our chats became a regular part of my evenings, a digital friendship blossoming in the neon glow of my computer screen. About a week after our initial contact, an odd email landed in my inbox. The sender's address was a string of numbers and letters at a now-defunct email service, something that didn't immediately raise red flags in those days of less savvy internet use. The message was brief and unsettling. "Hi there, I don't normally do this, but I felt the need to warn you. I'm not gay, and I don't agree with your lifestyle, but my conscience wouldn't let me stay silent. A friend of mine met Mike123 through this forum, and he was hurt badly. The police couldn't do anything. Just be careful." The email was unsigned, its words hanging in my mind like a dark cloud. I replied, asking for clarification, but never received a response. Despite the warning, curiosity overpowered my caution. Mike had never given me any reason to doubt his sincerity. Our interactions had been nothing but pleasant and supportive. Weeks passed without incident, and the email faded to the back of my mind, overshadowed by the daily rhythms of work and my nightly online adventures. Then, on a particularly slow day at the bookstore, my curiosity rekindled. I found myself wondering about Mike, about the warning, and about what secrets might lurk behind the screen names and pixelated avatars. On a whim, I decided to take a chance. I sent Mike a message, suggesting we meet in person. To my surprise, he agreed enthusiastically, suggesting we meet at his place the following afternoon. He explained that he lived in a duplex on a well-traveled street and even joked that the bustle of the neighborhood would keep any funny business at bay. The day of our meeting, I dressed casually but carefully, choosing a shirt that I thought complemented my eyes and jeans that were comfortably broken in. As I drove to Mike's address, the nerves set in. The mysterious email echoed in my mind, its warning a gnawing presence in my stomach. But as I pulled up to the duplex, seeing the normalcy of the busy street and the sun shining down on the tidy front yard, my anxiety began to melt away. I rang the doorbell, and Mike answered. He was slightly older than I'd pictured, his hair tinged with gray at the temples, but his smile was warm and his demeanor inviting. He led me inside, apologizing for the sparse furnishings as he explained that he was in the process of renovating. The interior of the duplex was indeed unusual. The living room was nearly empty except for a large stainless steel table that looked oddly out of place. Mike noticed my gaze lingering on it and laughed, explaining that it was a leftover from the previous tenant who had used the space as a medical office. As we chatted, I tried to push the eerie feeling down, telling myself that the empty space and the peculiar furniture were simply quirks of a transitional living situation. Mike offered me a drink, and as I accepted, I noticed him lock the door behind us with a deadbolt that required a key from both sides. My heart skipped a beat as the click of the lock sounded unnervingly final. As the sound of the lock echoed in the otherwise quiet room, a shiver ran down my spine. Mike had slipped the keys into his pocket with a casualness that seemed practiced, his smile still in place as he turned to face me. "It's just for privacy," he explained, seeing the question in my eyes. "You know how it is, better safe than sorry." His words were meant to reassure, but they did little to quell the unease that began to curl in my stomach. I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral, even as my mind raced with the vague warning from the anonymous email. The apartment was stark, the walls bare except for a few patches where paint had been stripped away, likely in preparation for renovation. Mike led me into the living room, where the large stainless steel table stood out incongruously against the sparse decor. It was indeed like something out of a medical clinic, complete with a recessed channel around its edge and an adjustable height feature. "Sorry about the mess," Mike said, gesturing broadly at the room. "I'm still figuring out what to do with some of this stuff. The previous tenant left in a hurry." We sat down, me on one of the two folding chairs he'd set out near the table. The chairs were an odd choice, uncomfortable and flimsy, but I focused on Mike, who seemed eager to dive into conversation. We started with safe topics: books we were reading, TV shows we liked, our experiences living in the Midwest. Mike was an engaging conversationalist, and his interest in the arts and culture seemed genuine. But as we talked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The room felt too open, too exposed. The blinds were drawn tight against the windows, casting the room in a gloomy light that made the afternoon feel like twilight. Mike excused himself to get our drinks from the kitchen, and I took the opportunity to glance around. The room felt colder than it should have, the air tinged with a sterile scent that didn't match the dusty corners and bare surfaces. I stood up, curiosity pushing me toward the table. It was then that I noticed the details that hadn't been apparent from afar. The table had attachments and features that seemed too specialized for general medical practice. My fingers traced the rim of the channel, cool and metallic, a shudder passing through me as I realized it was designed for drainage. Footsteps signaled Mike's return, and I quickly resumed my seat, my heart pounding louder than I would have liked. He handed me a soda, the Kindui with condensation, his fingers lingering slightly too long as our hands touched. "So," he began, settling back into his chair with a careful smile, "what brings you to someone like me? I mean, we've talked online, but I'm curious about what made you decide to meet in person." His question hung in the air, loaded with an unspoken weight. I sipped my drink, buying time to gather my thoughts. The truth was, curiosity and a sense of connection had drawn me here, but now that I was inside his strangely clinical living space, doubts clouded my mind. "I guess I wanted to see if the connection we had online was real," I said, aiming for honesty without revealing my growing apprehension. "Sometimes you just want to see the person behind the words." Mike nodded, his gaze intense. "I get that. It's why I invited you here. I want you to feel comfortable, to know I'm just a regular guy." The conversation shifted then, to more personal territories: past relationships, our experiences coming out, the struggles and triumphs of being gay in a predominantly straight world. Mike shared stories of his past, some filled with laughter, others tinged with sadness. He was open, vulnerable even, and for a moment, I allowed myself to relax, to engage with the man who seemed so earnest. As the afternoon wore on, the shadows in the room grew longer, and so did my sense of unease. The initial oddities: the locked door, the medical table, the starkness of the apartment mingled with Mike's stories, creating a mosaic of a man who was both familiar and utterly unknowable. It was during a lull in our conversation, as we both took a moment to sip our drinks, that I heard a faint noise from another part of the apartment. It was soft, almost like a sigh, too deliberate to be the building settling. Mike stiffened, his eyes flicking toward the hallway before returning to me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Old buildings, you know? Always making noise. But his casual dismissal felt forced, and a cold knot of fear settled in my gut. I nodded, setting my drink down with a hand that trembled just slightly. Actually, Mike, I started, voice steadier than I felt, I think I should head out. It's getting late, and I have work early tomorrow. His smile faltered, then returned, a bit too quickly. Of course, I understand. Let me walk you to the door. As Mike stood up to lead me to the door, the atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. His earlier warmth seemed to cool, his movements slightly more calculated. I followed him through the sparse living room, my senses heightened, every small sound magnified in the stillness of the apartment. We reached the back door, the same one I'd entered through, which he'd locked upon our arrival. My eyes darted to his pocket where I knew he'd placed the keys. A part of me wanted to rush, to demand he unlock the door immediately, but I knew I needed to maintain a calm exterior. Panic could provoke a reaction I was desperate to avoid. Mike seemed to sense my tension, though he covered it with a veneer of politeness. I really enjoyed our chat, he said, his hand fishing the keys out of his pocket. We should do this again sometime. Definitely, I replied, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. My eyes tracked his movements closely as he inserted the key into the deadbolt. The click of the lock disengaging was disproportionately loud in the quiet room. He swung the door open, stepping aside to let me pass. Safe travels, he said, a hint of something unreadable in his tone. Thanks, Mike. Take care, I managed, stepping out into the fading light of the late afternoon. I didn't turn back as I walked to my car, the gravel crunching underfoot sounding like thunder to my strained ears. Once inside the safety of my car, I didn't immediately start the engine. Instead, I took a moment to breathe, to allow the adrenaline coursing through my veins to ebb away. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and I closed my eyes, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside me. Relief mingled with confusion and fear. Why had I felt so uneasy? Was it just the strange setting, or was there something genuinely off about Mike? Driving away, I replayed our meeting in my mind. His politeness, the carefully curated conversation, the sterile setup of the apartment, all of it felt orchestrated, as if he'd been playing a part. And then there was the medical table, incongruous and unsettling in the otherwise empty room. When I got home, the first thing I did was go online. I needed to see if there was anything else I could find out about Mike, something I might have missed before. But my search turned up little, just the same chat room activity and benign presence I had initially encountered. Frustrated, I logged off, feeling the isolation of my apartment more acutely than ever. The next few days passed in a blur of routine, my encounter with Mike receding into the background as I focused on work and daily responsibilities. But the underlying tension never fully dissipated, a constant reminder of the unease I'd felt. It was almost a week later when I received another email. This time, it was from an address I recognized. It was Mike. My stomach churned as I opened the message, apprehensive about what it might contain. Hey, it began, casual as if nothing unusual had occurred. I really enjoyed our meeting the other day. I was thinking maybe we could go out for coffee next time? Somewhere public, maybe ease some of that obvious tension you felt. I stared at the screen, his words sending a shiver down my spine. He'd noticed my discomfort, then. And now he was suggesting another meeting, as if to reassure me or perhaps to gauge my suspicion. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I sat back, deep in thought. Part of me wanted to just ignore the message, to block him and move on with my life. But another part, a more curious and arguably reckless part, wondered if there was more to be discovered. What was he hiding? Was there a danger I'd narrowly avoided, or was I just being paranoid? The decision to respond took a day to form, each hour punctuated with bouts of rationalization and fear. Finally, I typed out a response, choosing my words with care. Hi Mike, coffee sounds good. Public place, like you said. Let's meet at the Central Library Cafe, lots of people, and I'd like to pick up a few books anyway. How does Saturday sound? I hit send before I could second-guess myself further, setting the stage for another encounter, this time on my terms. Saturday arrived with a brisk chill in the air, a reminder that the season was changing, leaves turning golden and the skies a clearer blue. As I approached the Central Library, the familiarity of the venue provided a small comfort. It was a place I frequented often, a sanctuary of sorts filled with the quiet hum of thoughts and whispered words. The public nature of our meeting place bolstered my confidence here. Surrounded by people and the security of the familiar, I felt a control that had eluded me in the stark isolation of Mike's apartment. I arrived early, choosing a table in the cafe that offered a clear view of the entrance. From here, I could watch the patrons come and go, my back against a wall, a strategic position that allowed me to see without being too exposed. The cafe was buzzing with a gentle din, the air rich with the smell of coffee and the rustle of newspapers and turning pages. Mike was punctual, appearing at the entrance of the cafe right on time. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on me with a nod of recognition. As he approached, I took a moment to really look at him, trying to see beyond the facade he presented. Today, he appeared less guarded, dressed casually in jeans and a soft sweater that made him seem more approachable, less like the man who had stood in a near-empty apartment that felt more like a stage set than a home. Hey, he greeted me with a smile as he sat down. Glad you could make it. Hi, Mike, I replied, my tone polite but reserved. The library was a good middle ground. Neutral territory. He chuckled, a light, easy sound. Absolutely. I figured it might make things less intense than last time. We ordered coffees, and as the barista went about preparing our drinks, Mike leaned in slightly, his demeanor earnest. Look, I wanted to apologize if last time felt weird. I'm in the middle of turning the place around, and I guess it can come off as a bit stark. I hope it didn't put you off too much. I nodded, appreciating his acknowledgement of the discomfort I'd felt. It was a bit surprising, I admitted. The setup is quite unusual. Yeah, I get that, he said with a slight frown. It was my uncle's place. He was a doctor. Left it to me when he passed. I've been slow to change things over. Sentimental value, you know? His explanation seemed plausible, and his tone conveyed a sincerity that was hard to dismiss outright. We shifted the conversation then, away from the personal and back to safer topics. We discussed books, shared recommendations, and debated film adaptations of classic novels. In this public, illuminated space, Mike was just another literature enthusiast, articulate and knowledgeable. Yet, even as we conversed on these benign subjects, part of my mind remained alert, parsing his words for inconsistencies, watching his expressions for signs of the mask slipping. It was exhausting, this scrutiny, but necessary. The email warnings and the oddness of our first meeting lingered in the back of my mind, a persistent whisper. As we wrapped up our coffee, Mike suggested a walk around the library. Have you seen the new exhibit on the second floor? It's all about the history of printmaking. Might be up your alley. Intrigued and somewhat reassured by the normalcy of our interaction, I agreed. We left our table and made our way to the exhibit, mingling with other patrons. The exhibit was fascinating, a display of ancient presses and modern interpretations, a celebration of the craft's evolution. Mike was knowledgeable, pointing out details I would have missed, his enthusiasm genuine. As we moved through the exhibit, I found myself relaxing, drawn into the subject and his company. It was as we were rounding a particularly detailed display of lithographic prints that I felt a hand on my shoulder. Startled, I turned, finding myself face to face with a woman whose expression bore a mix of concern and urgency. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her eyes flicking between Mike and me. "But I think you might want to hear what I have to say." "It's about him," she nodded subtly towards Mike, her voice low. Mike's face registered shock, then a flash of something darker before he masked it with confusion. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" he asked, his tone polite but cold. "No," she replied, "but I know about you. And if you'd give me a moment with your friend here, I think we can clear up a few things." The air between us charged with tension. I looked at Mike, then at the woman, my decision made in the split second it took to remember the fear I'd felt in his apartment. "All right," I said, nodding to her. "Let's talk." Mike's expression shifted subtly, a mixture of resignation and wariness settling in his eyes as he nodded. "I'll wait over there," he said, gesturing to a nearby bench before walking away, his steps measured, his back tensely set. The woman watched him move off, ensuring he was out of earshot before turning her attention back to me. Her eyes were sharp, observant, yet there was a kindness in them that softened her otherwise stern demeanor. "My name is Sarah," she began, her voice low and steady. "I used to work with Mike, or rather for his uncle, before he passed. I was a nurse in his practice." The connection piqued my interest, drawing my full attention. "You worked with his uncle?" I asked, trying to piece together the narrative Mike had presented and the reality before me. "Yes," Sarah nodded, her gaze flickering towards Mike's retreating figure before returning to me. "His uncle was a respected doctor, but not many knew about his private life, about the secrets he kept, and it seems Mike is walking a similar path." The implication of her words sent a chill down my spine, the memory of the sterile table and the locked door in Mike's apartment flashing vividly in my mind. "What kind of secrets?" I pressed, needing to understand the depth of what she suggested. Sarah glanced around the library, ensuring our conversation remained private. "The kind that harm others. His uncle had tendencies. Dark ones. He used his practice as a cover, a way to access certain tools and drugs. After his death, I thought it was over, but Mike inherited more than just his uncle's property." The pieces began to fall into place, a horrifying picture forming. "You think Mike is involved in something similar?" The question was more of a confirmation than a query. "I know he is," Sarah affirmed, her voice hard with certainty. "I've seen things, documents he forgot to dispose of, conversations I've overheard. I didn't want to believe it at first, but then I saw you two at the cafe. I thought you should know the truth." The gravity of her revelation weighed heavily on me. The warning email, the strange setup at the duplex, all these elements suddenly formed a coherent narrative that painted Mike in a sinister light. "Why haven't you gone to the police?" I asked, the obvious question hanging between us. "I did," she responded with a sigh. "But without concrete evidence, it's just my word against his. Mike is careful, very careful. The police need more than just accusations." Understanding the precariousness of her position, I felt a mix of gratitude and dread. Grateful for her courage to come forward, and dread for what it implied about my own interactions with Mike. "What should I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Be careful," Sarah advised. "I can try to gather more evidence, but in the meantime, stay away from him. If he realizes that you're suspicious, I don't know how he might react." I nodded, the severity of the situation settling in. "Thank you, Sarah, for telling me this. Nobody else should get hurt," she said, a determined look crossing her features. "If you think of anything that might help, any detail, let me know." We exchanged contact information, a plan forming tacitly between us. As we parted ways, I saw Mike still sitting on the bench, his posture relaxed but his eyes tracking every movement in the area. Walking back to him, my mind raced with the information Sarah had provided. Every step felt heavier, each breath more deliberate as I approached the man who was now a complete stranger in my eyes. Mike looked up as I neared, a smile plastered on his face, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Everything okay?" he asked, standing to meet me. "Everything's fine," I lied smoothly, the mask of normalcy plastered firmly in place. "Just needed some advice on a health issue." "If you ever need help, you know where to find me," Mike offered, his voice friendly yet a hint of something else lingered beneath. Was it suspicion, or merely curiosity? "I'll keep that in mind," I replied, keeping my tone light, non-committal. "I should head out, though. Got a busy day tomorrow." As I walked away, Mike's gaze felt heavy on my back, a silent observer marking my every step. The weight of the secrets I now carried pressed down on me, a burden I was unprepared for but knew I must bear, at least for now. Reaching the safety of my car, I took a few deep breaths, steadying the tremor in my hands. The drive home was a blur, my thoughts consumed with the web of deceit and danger I had unwittingly walked into. The real challenge lay ahead: how to extricate myself from this tangled situation without tipping Mike off. The drive home felt longer than usual, each traffic light and stop sign a momentary pause in the whirlwind of thoughts that raced through my mind. By the time I turned the key in the lock of my apartment, dusk had settled over the city, the fading light mirroring the darkening of my thoughts. Inside, the familiar confines of my living space, which had always offered solace, now seemed constricting, a place of potential vulnerability. I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows, a new habit born of the day's revelations. My mind replayed the conversation with Sarah, each detail a piece of a puzzle I was still struggling to understand fully. The warnings, the odd behaviors, and now, the unsettling confirmation of a darker reality connected to Mike, it all painted a chilling picture. That night, sleep proved elusive. My dreams, when they did come, were fragmented and anxious, filled with shadowy figures and the echo of locked doors clicking shut. Morning brought no relief, only the stark light of day and the knowledge that I needed to act, to find a way out of the tangled web in which I found myself. The first step was clear: I needed to gather more information. Whatever Sarah was planning to do in terms of collecting evidence, I felt an urgency to conduct my own investigation into Mike's background. The digital world, which had first connected me to Mike, now became my tool for delving deeper into his life. I started with the basics, revisiting the online forums and chat rooms where we had met. My approach was methodical, logging into each site under a pseudonym, searching for any traces of Mike's interactions that might reveal more about his character or intentions. The public posts revealed little, but they painted a picture of a man well-versed in digital communication, skilled at maintaining a charming and harmless facade. Next, I expanded my search to social media. Mike's profiles, where they existed, were sparse and carefully curated, showing nothing more than an interest in local history and various cultural events. It struck me then how deliberate he was, how each piece of information he shared was likely calculated to create a specific impression. Frustrated by the lack of concrete information, I decided to take a more direct approach. I reached out to mutual contacts we had online, casual acquaintances from the forums who might have interacted with him independently. My inquiries were casual, framed as part of catching up or discussing forum topics, careful not to arouse suspicion. Responses trickled in, mostly benign comments about his helpfulness or knowledge on certain subjects. However, one response caught my eye: a message from a user who hinted at a strange encounter with Mike. "He's got an edge, you know," the message read. "Like there's something not quite right under the surface." Made me a bit uneasy, to be honest. It was hardly the smoking gun I hoped for, but it was enough to confirm that Sarah and I weren't the only ones who sensed something amiss. I documented everything, creating a file of interactions, dates, and details that might later prove useful. The afternoon waned as I continued my search. I realized then that understanding Mike's present required digging into his past, specifically the uncle who had left him the property that seemed central to his activities. Public records provided the next pieces of the puzzle, offering up old newspaper articles and property deeds. The more I uncovered, the more the picture began to focus. Mike's uncle had been a well-respected doctor, yes, but there were hints of controversies, whispers of investigations that had never fully seen the light of day, likely smothered by a combination of community respect and legal maneuvering. Armed with this new information, I reached out to Sarah again, proposing a meeting to share what we had learned and to discuss our next steps. She agreed, the urgency in her voice matching my own. We decided to meet at a small, out-of-the-way cafe the following day, a place where we could talk freely without the risk of unwanted ears. As I prepared for bed, the weight of what I was doing settled around me. I was no detective, no hero in a thriller who could face down danger with unwavering courage. I was just a man, caught in circumstances far beyond the normal scope of my quiet life. Yet, there was a determination in me, a resolve that had been forged in the crucible of the past day's fears and revelations. I knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but I also knew I couldn't turn back. The stakes were too high, the risk to others too great. As I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, my resolve hardened. Tomorrow, I would meet with Sarah, and together, we would decide how to expose the truth hidden behind Mike's charming smile. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, an autumn chill in the air that matched my determined mood. I arrived early at the cafe where I was to meet Sarah, selecting a secluded table that afforded a clear view of the entrance. As I waited, I reviewed the notes I'd compiled, every interaction with Mike, every piece of evidence Sarah and I had discussed, every suspicious detail that now seemed so glaring in the harsh light of truth. Sarah arrived punctually, her demeanor serious and her eyes reflecting a resolve that mirrored my own. We exchanged greetings, and without much preamble, dived into the heart of our discussion. "I've been doing some digging on my own," I started, laying out the printouts of forum interactions and social media profiles I had gathered. "Mike is careful, but he's left traces. There are others who felt uneasy around him, though nothing concrete enough to take to the authorities yet." Sarah nodded, absorbing the information. "I've been pulling records from the clinic where his uncle worked and where Mike supposedly manages now. There are gaps, missing files, and some financial irregularities that don't add up. It looks like he might be using the clinic for other activities." Our conversation was a mesh of strategy and speculation. We knew we needed more tangible evidence to go to the police, something undeniable. We brainstormed potential ways to safely gather more information, each aware of the risks involved. "We need to get into that clinic," Sarah concluded, her voice low. "If I can find a way to legally access the files or even get some surveillance inside, we might find the proof we need." I agreed, feeling the weight of the task ahead. "Let me know how I can help. We're in this together." We parted with a plan in mind, each of us tasked with specific actions. I was to keep an eye on Mike's online activities, continuing to document anything out of the ordinary, while Sarah would use her contacts in the medical field to probe more deeply into the clinic's operations. The following weeks were a blur of activity. Sarah managed to secure a position as a consultant for the clinic, providing her with legitimate reasons to be on the premises and access certain areas. She was careful, always mindful not to arouse suspicion, her every move calculated and precise. Meanwhile, I maintained a low profile online, observing Mike's interactions and gathering any snippets of information that might be relevant. The dual life I was leading felt surreal, a constant balancing act between my everyday routines and the undercover investigation I was part of. Finally, Sarah called me with a breakthrough. "I got something," she said, her voice tense with excitement and anxiety. "I found records, hidden away in a locked file cabinet. Prescriptions for drugs that have no business being in a general clinic, sedatives, powerful ones, and in quantities that don't make sense." "That's it, then," I responded, feeling a mix of triumph and dread. We need to go to the police with this. With the evidence in hand, we arranged a meeting with local law enforcement. The officers were initially skeptical, but the documentation Sarah provided was too compelling to ignore. They agreed to set up a sting operation at the clinic, using our information to secure the necessary warrants. The day of the sting was nerve-wracking. Sarah was inside the clinic, wired for sound, her every move monitored by the police. I waited anxiously nearby, out of sight but ready to assist if needed. Hours ticked by, each minute stretching out endlessly. Finally, the call came through. The operation had been a success. Mike was caught red-handed, the evidence of his illicit activities laid bare before the authorities. It was a mix of relief and sorrow, relief that we had stopped him, and sorrow for the harm he had caused. The aftermath of the sting was a whirlwind. The clinic was shut down, and an investigation into Mike's activities was launched. Stories began to emerge, victims stepping forward with tales of manipulation and betrayal, a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for too long. Mike was charged with multiple counts of illegal drug possession, fraud, and other more serious charges as victim statements piled up. The case drew local media attention, the sordid details splashed across front pages and evening news segments. Through it all, Sarah and I stayed in contact, our bond forged in the fire of our shared ordeal. We were witnesses in the trial, our testimony a critical part of the case against Mike. When the guilty verdict was read, a palpable sense of closure filled the courtroom, a chapter finally closed on a painful part of many lives.